The enduring images of the Panzer formations of World War II are the famous battle tanks, the legendary Panthers and Tigers, which have become synonymous with the Wehrmacht. While they are undoubtedly the best known, they were by no means the most numerous fighting vehicles in the Panzer divisions. Every bit as important as these true tanks were their less celebrated cousins of the assault gun and tank destroyer formations. In many respects, they were similar machines to true tanks and frequently did the same job, but they sacrificed the benefits of the turret for the ability to mount a bigger gun, which was carried on a fixed mounting, pointing straight ahead at the enemy. In 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies captured this powerful monster, the Sturmtiger. The troops who knocked out this giant adversary must have breathed a huge sigh of relief, because this devastating machine was so powerfully armed. It had outgrown mere artillery power and was equipped with a rocket launcher of ferocious attacking force. It was designed to attack even the strongest fortification. Due to the range limitations of its rocket launcher, the Sturmtiger had to get very close to its target to fire its payload. But it was so heavily armored that it was nearly impervious to any anti-tank gun on the battlefield. The Sturmtiger's role was to rumble right up to infantry bunkers or strongpoints and fire the rocket at almost point-blank range. Obviously, the chances of survival for its target were slim indeed. The enormous rockets it carried were so heavy, the vehicle needed its own crane to be able to load the shells. Once loaded, the inside of the tank was so cramped, it carried enough rounds for only 13 shots. But when it did fire, the results were devastating. The Sturmtiger was the last in a line of turretless tanks, which the German army had produced in increasing quantities since the outbreak of World War II. But this highly specialized vehicle was produced so late in the war that only 19 were manufactured before Germany finally surrendered.
The idea was to fire an enormous shell with a sort of plunging round that would come whistling down out of heaven and whop whatever was underneath it good and hard. But really, a thing like that is a very specialist weapon and was probably, again, like many of the German developments of this time, more trouble than it was actually worth.
The number of Sturmtigers may have been very limited, but other turretless tanks were used in huge numbers by the Germans. Like all successful inventions, they had been adapted and improved over the 9 years since their introduction. In that time, their numbers had grown, so that by 1945, they were among the most numerous fighting vehicles in the German army, and with good reason.
Many German crews didn't like some of their own vehicles, which were too heavy, too slow, difficult to handle, had bad accommodation problems, had too low ammunition storages. You can have lists and lists of this kind of thing. It's almost a Darwinian process, you know, the survival of the fittest, as it were, the survival of the most suitable for the battlefield, the survival of that equipment which is workable and handleable and can be profitably and successfully used by the crews.
Unfortunately, the first attempts to produce a specialist tank hunter favored the simple expedient of mounting a 4.7 centimeter anti-tank gun on the chassis of the tiny Panzer I. It was a failure. Although the 4.7 was more effective than the puny 3.7, which originally equipped the Panzer III, it was still feeble compared to the 75mm gun of a Russian T-34. In addition, the open fighting compartment gave only limited protection to the crew. Another problem was the instability of the top-heavy assembly. Frequently, these tank hunters simply toppled over. During 1942, frustrating attempts were made to improve upon the Panzer I in the form of the Marder II and III tank destroyers. These strange hybrids used the Panzer II chassis, the Czech 38T chassis, and sometimes even mounted a captured Russian 76mm anti-tank gun. They proved to be little more than an improvised stopgap in a steadily worsening situation on the Eastern Front. But they did go some way towards holding the advancing tide of Russian armor, while real tank killers could be developed.
They discovered very early in 1941 that they didn't have anti-tank capability. They just didn't. So what they did, they improvised, and they took, as you know, the Czech 38T tank. It was a Czech tank built by Skoda, and stuck a captured Russian anti-tank guns on top of it. And that became, you know, the Marder 3. The first Marder was actually an anti-tank gun stuck on a French Lorraine chassis. Well, that wasn't much good. But you really had to do something very quick. And the strange thing is that that whole series of German vehicles produced on the chassis of the Czech 38T and the 38D became really very successful. Partly because the chassis and the suspension was very good, and partly because they put the right guns on it. And so when you've got machines like that, which in fact perform very well, whatever their hybrid origins, if they work in the field, that's fine. But that's an extraordinary story, I think, of the marriage between Czech tank design, Russian anti-tank guns, and, if I may put it this way, German adaptive engineering, and you get virtually a different weapon system, and a very successful one, and which in fact even outlasted the end of the Second World War.
The first two specialized tank hunting machines proved to be almost as disappointing as the Marders. The massive Elephant looked good on paper. It was based on the 80 Porsche chassis, which had been built for a proposed rival to the Tiger. This gave the five-man crew the same all-round protection as the Sturmgeschütz. In addition, the Elephant was massively armored and sported the deadly 88mm gun. It made a much heralded debut at the Battle of Kursk. Despite all the portents, the Elephant proved to be an unmitigated disaster.
They needed vehicles to get out to the Eastern Front, and so what the German Army did was they welded on the back end of this big chassis a citadel, armored it, and put a big 88mm gun. What they failed to do, however, was put a machine gun on it, and so you had Russian infantry climbing aboard and burning the crews.
Soviet tank hunting teams had a field day. The hapless crews inside the Elephant had no means of effective resistance against infantry, and 40 of the 80 Elephants deployed at Kursk were destroyed in the first 2 days of fighting.
It wasn't everybody's favorite. It was very difficult to handle. It was a huge target itself. I mean, who wanted to be burned alive or blown to pieces in one of these things?
So very rapidly, the German Ordnance Corps develops a machine gun that all you had to do was pop the hatch, stick this thing out, and it had a curved barrel. And you could hose the vehicle off with this curved barrel weapon. So a very innovative way to do things.
The remaining machines were ignominiously withdrawn to be refitted with machine guns before being sent to Italy, where the survivors were destroyed in the battles following the Anzio landings. More effective in battle than the Elephant was the Nashorn, or rhinoceros. It also featured the fearsome 88mm gun, but inexplicably left the crew unprotected in an open fighting compartment. The high silhouette of the Nashorn made it an easy target, but nonetheless, nearly 500 were issued between 1943 and 1944.
The Nashorn was the chassis of the Panzer IV that they took the turret off of and put not so well armored, but a citadel on the back of that, and they also put an 88mm gun on that. And the idea was, of course, to pick off the so that they couldn't close down on your position.
The Nashorn was phased out with the introduction of the first really successful purpose-designed German tank hunter, the Jagdpanzer IV. Manufactured by Vomag, this sleek machine boasted low silhouette, a machine gun for close defense, and gave its crew the all-round protection of thick, well-sloped armor. The first really effective purpose-designed tank killer had arrived. But in 1944, it had arrived too late to tip the balance.
It's the Jagdpanzer 4 long. Carries the L70 gun the same as the Panther, 75mm. This is a early 44 model. It was abandoned late 44, captured by the Allies, brought back to this country for test and evaluation. It's stayed here ever since. It had a 5-man crew, very cramped, very noisy, very dirty.
The Allied bombing campaigns, now paralyzing Germany's industry, limited the numbers produced to just under 1,800. By this stage of the war, there was never going to be enough to stem the tide of armor flooding in against Germany from every side. To complement the Panzerjäger IV in these last-ditch battles, the Czech manufacturers, Praga, finally managed to produce a first-class tank destroyer. This was the Hetzer. Much smaller than the Panzerjäger IV, it nonetheless packed a highly effective 76mm gun. Coupled with very good sloping armor, excellent mobility and a very low silhouette, this small vehicle, which resembled a miniature Panzerjäger, was deceptively powerful and was much loved by its crews. Efficient manufacturers, and some 2,500 machines reached the hard-pressed front lines.
This is the Hetzer, and one of the things about it is it's a marked improvement over some of the earlier German anti-tank guns. A lot of the earlier German anti-tank guns were open, and as you can see, this vehicle is completely enclosed. It has a very high-velocity 75mm gun. It's made in Czechoslovakia. Very good suspension system, a very good engine, and the crews liked it very, very, very much.
These knocked-out Hetzers from the archives of the Tank Museum at Bovington show just how common they were in the Normandy battles. Supplied in even more limited numbers was the next machine to emerge from the German armament industry, the Jagdpanther. Based on the successful chassis tank design for the Panther tank, by following the principle of dispensing with the turret, the Jagdpanther could carry a high-velocity 88mm gun, as opposed to the 76mm gun of the ordinary Panther. Its superb sloped armor gave the Jagdpanther enormous defensive advantages, a relatively low silhouette, and a fearsome attacking power. However, production difficulties meant only 350 of this, the best tank destroyer of the war, ever reached the front. This rare footage shows a transporter train moving these precious machines to the hard-pressed Russian front.
This is the Jagdpanther. It's been called the best tank destroyer of World War II, and that's probably the case. It has a very, very good gun. It's an 88mm gun. The Panther itself had a 75mm gun, but by doing away with the turret, you can lower the profile of the vehicle, you can armor up the front of this very, very well, and it became a very, very effective anti-tank weapon. The crews liked it, but it does have some deficiencies, not the least of which is the running gear. Now, if you notice, the running gear here is shaped very oddly. You have a single wheel here, but two road wheels here, a single here, two here, and so on and so forth. Well, one of the things that happens with this vehicle is mud gets up in here and it would freeze. And so you get up the next morning and you have a pillbox. That's one fault. The other problem, though, is notice that if this road wheel back in here, the one back in here, fails and you need to replace it, you need to take off 5 road wheels. This one, that one, this one, and this one to get to it. So there's a lot of maintenance involved in this vehicle. And two, back up here on the back deck, if you have to work on this thing, if it broke down, there are a lot of places where you have to work upside down and blind on it. And if you drop your tools, they're gone.
In even shorter supply than the Panther was the cumbersome Jagdtiger, a veritable fortress on tracks. In keeping with the German practice of mounting larger guns into turretless tanks, the Jagdtiger mounted a massive high-velocity 128mm gun, which was so powerful it could destroy any Allied tank on the battlefield at almost any range. Fortunately for the Allies, only 48 were produced, and these so late in the war that even their massive firepower could not hope to thwart the inevitable tide of defeat. Most were destroyed by their own crews when they ran out of fuel, broke down, or had fired the last of their ammunition.
This is the Jagdtiger, and this is a really bad idea. It's the chassis of the Tiger II tank. It has a 128mm gun in it. It's the largest anti-tank gun mounted on a chassis in World War II. But the vehicle is just huge. Combat loaded weight of about 85 tons. So no bridge could support it in Europe. There's a major river, every 50 miles in Europe, so no bridge could take it. You had to raft it across rivers. And two, it gets about 8 gallons to the mile. This when the German army had very little fuel. When you fill this thing up with a fuel browser, you're looking around for another one right away. These are the fuel tracks. And when this thing moved by railroad track, you had to put on smaller tracks so the two trains could pass each other on parallel tracks. So the crews did not like this vehicle. It was sort of meat on the table for rocket-firing Typhoon and T-51 aircraft.
The stalemate of the trenches during the Great War had a lasting effect on all the participants in that appalling conflict. Germany had suffered more than any other nation from the grim years of the Great War. But it was the British who had found the potential means to unlock the stalemate. The introduction of the tank in 1916 could well have revolutionized the course of the Great War and broken the deadlock. But the potential of this new innovation was stifled by a lack of strategic vision in the British High Command, and the possibility of an early return to open warfare was thrown away by poor British tactics. By 1917, the first British tanks had fallen into German hands, and these captured British machines were soon copied and adapted to produce the first German machines. This is an A7V Sturmpanzerwagen, the first German tank to go into battle. It was knocked out by the British in 1918. These early tanks were produced too late to make an impact in the First World War, but the lessons were not forgotten by the German military men. In 1939, the scars which came from long years of attritional warfare during the Great War were still fresh for the defeated Wehrmacht. In consequence, Germany's new breed of commanders were determined not to repeat the mistakes of 1918. They saw the tank as a key element in that vision, and they embraced the new tactical doctrine of blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Blitzkrieg tactics relied upon the possibility of fast, mobile operations, spearheaded by large concentrations of fast, well-armored battle tanks. Under blitzkrieg tactics, all of the tanks of the army were concentrated into the fast-moving panzer divisions, which would thrust deep into the rear positions of an enemy force, spreading panic and confusion from the narrow point of penetration. The shock of the advance required a high level of artillery support at the point of attack, and also harnessed the extra power of air interdiction. But in the 1930s, the bulk of Germany's heavy artillery forces was still horse-drawn. What this meant was that the advancing tanks and motorized infantry would rapidly outstrip the artillery support. Even mechanized prime movers like these half-tracks had their disadvantages. Time taken to move into position and deploy the guns for action under battlefield conditions meant vital time was lost. In battle, split seconds literally meant the difference between life and death.
The Blitzkrieg depended on several elements working in conjunction with each other. One was air support given by the Luftwaffe in the form of things like dive bombers, the Ju-87. And the other thing was artillery support. But one of the things about artillery in the German army during the Blitzkrieg era was that that was mainly direct fire artillery, that they were going after point targets because the Air Force was taking out also point targets. Bring in massive amounts of artillery. In fact, the Germans never do develop that during World War II, nor do any other armies except for the American Army.
If artillery was to play a real role in the new mobile warfare, it needed to be able to operate as close to the battle zone as possible. But the closer artillery pieces got to the action, the more vulnerable the gunners were to enemy fire. What was needed was an assault gun, a mobile artillery piece which could keep pace with the mechanized infantry, afford the gunners a measure of protection, and provide support on the battlefield at short notice, where it really mattered, in the very front line. A fully armored and fully tracked mobile gun platform therefore had great appeal from the point of view of both mobility and crew protection. It also provided a means of providing close artillery support fire right in the very front line. Orders were dispatched for prototype vehicles. The successful prototype was produced in 1936 by the Olcott Company. The final vehicle was actually constructed from two separate elements, and it mounted a heavy 75mm gun on a Panzer III tank chassis. The 75mm was a heavier weapon than could normally be carried on a Panzer III, but the extra space for the heavier gun was achieved by dispensing with the turret and setting the gun on a fixed mount with a limited traverse. The Sturmgeschütz was born.
These are vehicles called Stug. They're the chassis of the Panzerkampfwagen Mark III. And when the Germans realized that the Panzer III was obsolete on the battlefield, they took the turrets off and installed these weapons on the chassis. The one here in the foreground has a 105mm gun and is mobile artillery in effect. And the one in the background has a 75mm gun and is an anti-tank weapon. Both of them were very effective vehicles on the battlefield.
Naturally, the grenadiers fighting in the front lines welcomed this development with open arms. Here was an artillery piece which could fight with the infantry at the crucial point of the battlefield and move at their pace. Throughout the long years of World War II, the Sturmgeschütz crews never came to regard themselves as tank men. They wore different uniforms and still considered themselves to be artillerymen who happened to man mobile assault guns. But they were still gunners at heart.
Who commands them? The tank crews, the tank chaps said, there are guns. And the artillery said, no, there are guns. And I think, and I rather know, that each side in each army, each one had their favourites, as it were. But it depended what the tactical task was. The Wehrmacht had to discover the relationship between their self-propelled anti-tank artillery, their armour, and then specialised self-propelled artillery doing various kinds of jobs.
From the gunners' point of view, they quickly grew to love the Sturmgeschütz. After all, they were now protected against direct infantry fire and felt themselves impervious to anything but direct artillery fire. The powerful 75mm gun meant they packed a real punch in the attack. The Sturmgeschütz had a crew of 4: the commander, driver, loader, and gunner. It soon became the proud boast of the Sturmgeschütz crews that their men were all volunteers, always ready to answer the infantryman's call to bring up the guns. The new assault gunners took to the role with great enthusiasm. Although the cramped interior of each Geschütz officially had room for only 44 rounds, the crews soon found that they could carry 90 rounds of ammunition by stacking extra rounds in layers on the floor of the vehicle. This meant the guns could stay in action for longer and continue to give their support to the infantry for longer periods. In the coming years, that would be a great advantage.
One of the things about the German army in World War II is that they're elastic in their tactics, and they're elastic in their doctrine as to how they do things. For instance, in the Stug, I forget how many rounds the thing carries right now, but they would stick as many rounds as they could get into the thing, and they would be awash in rounds inside that vehicle. And the vehicle is not very roomy to start with, but they found very, very innovative ways to stick rounds into the vehicle.
Despite the early signs of promise, these first machines were produced in small numbers, and only 30 Geschützes were available for the French campaign of 1940. But they acquitted themselves well in their first actions. Orders were immediately given for the production of a further 500 machines. These machines equipped the first Sturmgeschütz batteries which served in the Blitzkrieg campaigns through the Balkans and into Russia.
It's not going to fight like a tank in the normal sense. It's not going to get into direct assault action. It's going to support the tank by bringing in wider natures of firepower, more high explosive and that kind of thing. The great advantage of a self-propelled gun is that you can get a larger gun onto a given chassis than you could if it was in a turret. And you do that, as in the case of the machine behind me, by putting a 75mm gun into a fixed superstructure on the tank, where in a gun tank you'd probably get no more than a 50mm gun onto the same chassis.
Initially, Sturmgeschützes were organized into independent battalions. Each battalion was composed of 3 troops, which originally had 6 guns each. The commander of the battalion also had his own vehicle. In later years, the number of vehicles in each troop was raised to 10, and the battalions were renamed as brigades, which in theory fielded 31 Sturmgeschütz. In practice, these ideals were hardly ever achieved, and then only highly favored formations received the full complement. In battle, these independent brigades were then allocated to support infantry formations for a specific action, and came under the command of the infantry they were ordered to support. As the war grew, the Sturmgeschütz commanders naturally gained a wealth of battle experience, gained from almost constant exposure to action. So in practice, it was frequently the infantry commanders who took the lead from the more experienced assault gun leaders. The official regulations stressed that the Sturmgeschütz should be employed en masse. But the constant demands of a terrible war meant that they were more often employed as single battalions, or even single machines. One shortcoming of the early Sturmgeschütz was the lack of a machine gun for close support against enemy infantry. A number of Sturmgeschütz had been lost to Russian infantry, which could have been avoided if the crew had had the means to fire back at close range.
One of the things that both tanks and assault guns need is a machine gun. And in fact, one of the big mistakes the Germans make in World War II, they don't put a machine gun on it. Now, if you think about that for a little bit, Russian infantry learns real quick that they can vehicle, pour gasoline into the top and torch the crew, detrimental to health and morale. But a machine gun is vital for the close defense of your vehicle and to protect other vehicles.
The lack of close defense capability was rectified in 1941 with the introduction of the machine gun mounted on the Model E, of which a further 272 were produced. The Sturmgeschütz made a valuable contribution to the success of Operation Barbarossa, but despite the initial successes, By late 1941, it was apparent that the German armored force as a whole was seriously undergunned. The armored forces of the Wehrmacht were in danger of being swamped by the new Russian T-34 tanks. The waves of Russian tanks armed with the high-velocity 76mm gun were far more deadly at longer ranges than the 50mm gun, which equipped most of the Panzer IIIs, which was then Germany's main battle tank. The short 75mm gun of the Sturmgeschütz was really designed to fire low-velocity, high-explosive shells in support of infantry formations. And although it used the relatively small chassis of the Panzer III, the fact that it had no turret allowed the Stug to be upgunned to incorporate the deadly, long-barreled 75mm gun, which could not be fitted to a Panzer III. With this gun, the Sturmgeschütz was more than a match for the T-34. The addition of such a powerful L-43 anti-tank gun made the Sturmgeschütz much more than an infantry support weapon. It was now apparent that with its low silhouette, the Stug was a much harder target to hit than the Russian T-34. The sloped armor also helped to deflect shots away from the vehicle, and the scales gradually began to tip back in Germany's favor during the fierce tank battles of 1942. This much-needed upgrade was first incorporated into the Sturmgeschütz Model F in 1942. The long-barreled L-43 gun gave the armor-piercing shells fired by the Geschütz a much higher muzzle velocity, and therefore a far greater tank-killing capability than the 50mm gun of the Panzer III. It was now obvious that the Panzer III had evolved as far as it could, and the model was phased out. From 1943, the Panzer III chassis were used exclusively for the manufacture of Sturmgeschütz, production of which continued right up to the last days of the war. The pressure of battle on the Eastern Front meant that almost by accident, the German forces had evolved a very successful example of a new breed of fighting vehicles, which were to emerge in World War II, the Panzerjäger, or tank hunters. It was in this role that most Sturmgeschütz were to be employed for the rest of the war. It was a role for which they were eminently suitable. 20,000 enemy tank kills were claimed by assault gun crews up to the early months of 1944. The only major disadvantage of the Geschütz was the lack of a turret. This meant that instead of simply swinging the motorized turret round to face an enemy threat to the side or rear, the whole vehicle had to be moved round on its tracks. The Sturmgeschütz manual stressed time and time again the need for the gun to be stationary when firing. In this way, the highest level of accuracy was achieved. When the commanders heeded this request, the results were devastating. In a mobile battle where every second counts, the lack of a turret was a very real disadvantage. But Sturmgeschütz crews learned to adopt defensive tactics designed to lure Russian tanks into carefully constructed killing grounds.
With an assault gun, such as, say, the Panther or a Sturmgeschütz, one of the problems with it is that it has no turret, and the gun is fixed into the hull. Now, they have a certain amount of deflection that you can get with that gun, but not a lot. Now, if you're fighting a defensive fight, that's not altogether a bad thing, because you can lower the profile of the vehicle by not having a turret, and you can get into these defensive positions, and you can then, in effect, aim the vehicle down armored avenues of approach into your position. So while you're fighting a defensive fight, that's not altogether a bad thing. However, if you go over to the offensive, where you do not know where the enemy is going to pop up, the lack of a turret is a very, very serious drawback.
The new tactics certainly worked, and in early 1943 there was another increase in gun power, with the introduction of the long 48 gun, which gave extra velocity and hence extra killing power. It was this new gun which equipped the definitive Sturmgeschütz, the Model G, of which 7,720 were eventually manufactured. The sheer numbers produced is a reflection of just how effective and popular the Sturmgeschütz was in battle. By comparison to the 11,500 Sturmgeschütz manufactured, only 4,500 Panzer IIIs, 6,800 Panzer IVs, and 6,000 Panthers were manufactured in the same period. While the turreted tanks took on the role of the battlefield rovers, designed to forge ahead of the infantry in wide-ranging strategic advances, it was the Sturmgeschütz who accompanied the grenadiers during the dogged fighting on the ground. As the war dragged on, they became the infantry's rock in defense and his armored fist in attack. By 1943, the Sturmgeschütz was an indispensable part of both the Panzer Division and the Ordinary Infantry Division. The infantry soon came to know that as long as the Geschütz were in the line, things were in control. Extraordinary results were achieved by skilled crews in Russia, who sometimes accounted for dozens of Russian machines in a single action. In those actions, a major issue for the Sturmgeschütz commanders was the limited fuel and ammunition capacity of their cramped vehicles. This produced a constant need to leave the battlefield to refuel the vehicles and reload with ammunition. As the war progressed, the soldiers in the front line increasingly took strength from the presence of the Geschütz, so the tactical manual for their employment went to great lengths to stress the importance of the Sturmgeschütz commander in keeping his infantry commanders informed that his guns were leaving the line only to rearm and refuel. It was a standard rule of Sturmgeschütz tactical doctrine that if possible, not all machines would be withdrawn from the line at the same time, but that they should leave the field in relays. Otherwise, there was a real danger that the morale of the infantry might collapse if they saw their beloved Geschütz withdrawing from the field. Despite its undoubted success as a tank killer, there was still an infantry support role for the Sturmgeschütz. The low-trajectory 7.5-meter gun was an excellent anti-tank gun, but to reach infantry hiding behind obstacles or other terrain features, a high-trajectory howitzer was still required. A further 1,100 Sturmgeschütz were therefore manufactured with the 10.5 howitzer, which packed a deadly, high-explosive punch, which could be used in support of the infantry, either in attack or, more usually, desperate defense. The theory was that for every 2 troops of 75mm armored Geschütz to deal with enemy tanks, there would be 1 troop of howitzer-armed Geschütz to deal with the infantry. Problems with supplies of vehicles meant that this situation was very rarely achieved in practice. The tactics set down for cooperation between the 2 types of assault guns was that the guns armed with 7.5 guns would target any enemy armor, while the howitzer-armored vehicles would concentrate on the infantry who accompanied the tanks. In this way, countless Russian attacks came to grief on the Bulge provided by the Sturmgeschütz battalions. By 1943, the obvious success of the Sturmgeschütz in the field led the Allies to target the Alket factory, responsible for the production of Stug 3s, for priority bombing. The resultant saturation bombing severely damaged the production factories. During the period of rebuilding, production was switched from Alket to Krupp's tank works, but Krupp's made Panzer IVs, not Panzer IIIs. During the 1,500 Sturmgeschütz which were manufactured by Krupp's used the Panzer IV tank chassis, combined with the highly successful L-48 gun. These machines were known as Sturmgeschütz IVs, but were no less successful than the old Stug 3. The welded steel skirt were added to all Stug 3s and 4s from 1943 onwards as a protection against the new hollow charge infantry weapons which had wreaked so much damage since their introduction in late 1943.
Well, each tank had its own characteristics and for particular operational tasks. And you can see in the German evolution of German Sturmgeschütze, you know, the German assault guns, some had very long wartime lives, which was astonishing. They proved to be sturdy, they proved to be reliable, and they proved to do their job quite well. And they were to the satisfaction both of their crews, and they fitted well into the tactical scene.
By the end of the war, no less than 30,000 enemy tanks had been destroyed by the Geschütz crews, a ratio of approximately 3 enemy vehicles to every Stug deployed. It was a mark of the achievement of the guns and the crews that Russian orders forbade their tank commanders from entering into artillery duels with the Geschütz, ordering them instead to maneuver to find the weaker side and rear armor. One famous variant of the Stug 4 was a real heavyweight, the forerunner of the Sturmtiger. This was the mighty Brummbär, the grizzly bear, or grumbler, which carried a powerful 15-centimeter howitzer. The Brummbär had sloping frontal armor 100 millimeters thick, and it was designed to rumble up to infantry fortifications before firing its massive shell at point-blank range. The Brummbär was originally developed to cope with the close-quarter street fighting at Stalingrad, but delays in production meant that they did not see active service until the Battle of Kursk in 1943. After Kursk, Germany was largely fighting a defensive war, but on the few occasions when the Brummbär saw action, they acquitted themselves well, and over 300 were produced by the end of the war.
The Brummbär that you see behind me is nothing more than the chassis of the Panzerkampfwagen Mark IV with a big gun on it, mounted in the citadel, as you can see. And the reason this vehicle came about was the Germans learned very quickly in the Battle of Stalingrad that they had problems of taking out defensive positions in towns, and also defensive positions one and all. So this came about as to take out those type of positions. So you have a 150 millimeter gun, very short little barreled gun, but it was very good for firing like plastic charges up against fortifications and knocking them out.
The eventual production of Sturmgeschütz totaled some 11,500, more than any other mark of German fighting vehicle. There were sound reasons for this, as not only was Sturmgeschütz successful on the battlefield, they were also far less expensive, quicker and easier to manufacture than fully turreted tanks built on the same chassis. This was a vital consideration for Germany's hard-pressed manufacturing industry. German armies on all fronts were desperate for armored fighting vehicles to stem the flood of Russian and Allied armor. So production resources were increasingly switched to the production of Sturmgeschütz, which were well suited to fighting a defensive war. In 1943, the role of Sturmgeschütz as protectors of the infantry was reversed when each increasingly precious gun was given its own dedicated squad of grenadiers to protect these valuable machines against the increasingly sophisticated weapons carried by Allied tank hunting teams. Although it was not purpose-designed as a tank killer, the Stug had provided a solid solution to the tank destroyer role, almost by accident. German attempts to produce a dedicated tank killer by design were far more troubled. The Sturmgeschütz experience had shown that by dispensing with a tank turret, it was possible to mount a much heavier gun on the existing tank chassis. Despite the inevitability of the final defeat, the men of the Sturmgeschütz and Panzerjäger formations fought like lions to the bitter end. Losses grew to frightening proportions, and many panzer divisions fought until literally the last machine rumbled into its final battle. Even by the last day of fighting, the ranks of the Sturmgeschütz crews were still filled mainly with volunteers who did their duty in the face of almost certain death. In in later years, it was to become the proud boast that when the cry went up from the hard-pressed grenadiers, they were always there to answer their call to bring up the guns.
After the German failure at Kursk, even Hitler had at last begun to realize that it was now impossible to inflict a serious defeat on the Russians. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, Hitler did believe that a well-executed offensive in the West could defeat the Western Allies and free up much-needed forces for the East to at least try and halt the Russian advances. With his planned Western offensive, he believed that he could force the Allies to sue for peace from a stalemate position. But even Hitler must have known that this was the last chance for the Panzers.
The basic reason for the Ardennes offensive was that in late 1944, Germany was obviously facing defeat within a measurable period of time. In the west, the British and American forces were closing up on the Rhine, and in the east, the Russians were poised to invade East Germany and flood on into Berlin.
Hitler decided that he needed to sustain the war, and the one way was to counter-offensive in the west and try and split the armies in the west, and then hopefully we would sue for peace, and then he could turn all his attention through to Russia. This resulted in a battle in the Ardennes, which is quite commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge.
By a small miracle of logistics, the hard-pressed Germans of the Third Reich somehow managed to scrape together the men and machines for one last great offensive. In the middle of December 1944, Hitler launched his surprise winter offensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium. For this offensive, 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles had somehow been assembled. After the destructive battles through France in the summer, this force represented the very last reserves of manpower. Hitler placed all of his hopes on this, the last great offensive in the West during World War II.
The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last gamble, because he committed all of his forces in the West, the entire armies and air forces, to the Ardennes offensive. And if that offensive failed, he had no reserves, and there was nothing to stop the Allies going into Germany.
The plan for the attack was fairly straightforward. The Ardennes region provided a successful launchpad for the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940. Once again, Hitler planned to push a strong armour-led thrust through the Allied-held positions and on to Antwerp.
The Ardennes offensive, or as the Germans called it, the von Rundstedt offensive, as the Americans called it, the Battle of the Bulge. The idea of this offensive was to split the Allied forces, the British and the Canadians in the north and the Americans in the south, split the Allied forces and aim for the port of Antwerp, which was by then the main port for the supplies for the Allied armies. It would achieve several objectives. It would cut off the supplies to the Allied armies. It would also split the Allied armies, and the Germans were well aware of the personality conflicts and clashes between the various Allied commanders, and they thought that this would help. And they also thought that as they'd done it in 1940 and surprised the French by going through the Ardennes, they could do it in 1944.
Unlike 1940, however, the Germans were fighting an army who were used to their tactics. This time the Allies had better equipped forces that they could call upon to meet any threat. The terrain and supply problems did not favor the Germans this time either. The German generals could see the shortcomings of the offensive. But at this late stage in the war, few of them dared to question Hitler's authority for fear of their lives.
There was perhaps some possibility of success for the Ardennes offensive, but it was a gambler's throw. Hitler was relying very much upon surprise, upon the hope that the winter weather would prevent Allied aircraft from taking to the air and interfering, that they would capture Allied fuel supplies to fuel the drive on. However, he did have 100 miles to go to Antwerp, and his generals rather thought that it might be better to go for a shorter victory to try to pin the Allied armies against the line of the River Meuse, about halfway towards Antwerp. He was risking, however, a lot upon surprise and upon the superiority and the fanaticism of his tank crews and infantry.
The Germans had been busy in developing new tanks and assault gun designs during this period. One of the most significant new designs was the Tiger IIB, or King Tiger. This tank weighed 68 tons and was manned by 5 crew members. The main armament was the dauntingly high-velocity 88mm L-71 cannon. This was backed up with 2 7.92mm machine guns. The armor protection was formidable, and the top speed was a respectable 24 miles an hour.
By 1944, and at the end of 1944, German tank design had responded to the designs put forward by the Russians of the IS-2, and they had developed what is known as the King Tiger, or Tiger B. This was a very impressive vehicle. If it was used today, it would still be a very impressive vehicle. It had a very large gun, much larger than a normal Tiger. It was still an 88, but much longer. It had sloping armour, very similar to the Panther, but in a much bigger design. They only ever built around about 470 of these vehicles, but they were unfortunately only used in small quantities, and probably only 70 at any one time were available for use.
The King Tiger was ordered after Hitler demanded a tank that could mount the massively powerful L-71 main gun. Even the mighty Tiger I was unable to do this, so in January 1943, the order was placed for the new machine. The first vehicles came off the production line a year later.
Heavier tanks became necessary during the Second World War for all of the combatants, and the reason was that it was found that in combat, survival depended upon having a good big gun and lots of armour. If you had those, you could survive, but tanks that were more thinly skinned perished quite quickly.
The first 50 King Tigers were fitted with a turret made by Porsche, who were later to become famous for rather different reasons. The remaining 439 Tiger IIs were fitted with the Henschel turret. The Porsche turrets were originally built for a Porsche design of the Tiger I. When this contract was unexpectedly awarded elsewhere, Porsche had already completed 50 turrets, and they were found to be large enough to accommodate the larger gun. The sole remaining example of this type can be found in the Tank Museum in Bovington.
This is the Sonderkraftzug 182, better known as the King Tiger. it really represents the absolute limits of tank design in World War II. In some respects, we've actually passed the limits, because at 75 tons, this vehicle really is too heavy for the suspension that's intended to take it and for the engine that's designed to drive it along. But it does have a number of features that you would see in post-war tanks, and as you can see, the lessons of World War II tank fighting had been incorporated into the Tiger II, because in addition to having this enormous thickness of armour, which is 180 millimeters thick, it's also sloped, so it was designed to deflect shots away from the vehicle, and that's what happened in practice. So in that respect, Germany had come very close to producing the ultimate machine on the battlefield. But that's all they'd done, they'd come close, because it had so many disadvantages that it completely outweighed the advantages it had.
The first time that King Tigers saw action was during the Allied invasion of France in June 1944. Around 15 King Tigers were involved in these battles. A full battalion of 45 King Tigers was later sent to the Arnhem area in September 1944. They helped to ensure that the Allied Market Garden operation was thwarted. They were next to feature in the coming German offensive in the Ardennes. Like the Tiger I, this tank was better suited to the open country, and the majority of them were sent east to battle with the advancing Russians. A full battalion of 45 tanks was earmarked for the assault. The SS 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, which was part of the 6th Panzer Army, was placed with Kampfgruppe Piper at the front of the armoured advance.
The spearhead of the Ardennes offensive was the King Tiger tank, which was the first time it was used en masse. The problem was that the King Tiger was too heavy, too large and too cumbersome to get through the very narrow valleys and through the forests that comprise the Ardennes.
Now, it may have been formidable on the battlefield, but there were a number of problems with regard to getting this thing into action. They were massively prone to breakdown. They were very difficult to keep running. The other thing that was likely to happen with the complete control of the air that the Allies had was that the Germans were unable to bring forward sufficient fuel to keep a beast like this running.
Besides tanks, the German forces had also come to rely upon turretless tank destroyers, which sacrificed the tank turrets in return for the ability to mount a bigger gun and better armor. They were also easier and cheaper to produce under the difficult conditions which the Germans now faced. They were also ideally suited for defensive warfare. By late 1944, the assault guns and tank destroyers had become a valuable addition to the German arsenal. Following on from earlier tank destroyer designs, the chassis of the King Tiger was adapted to create a new heavy tank destroyer, the Jagdtiger. The resulting monster weighed in at 70 tons and required a 6-man crew. The main armament was the massively powerful 128mm cannon, which fired a shell of such high velocity that it could blow apart any Allied tank by the massive power of the kinetic energy in the solid metal shell. The armor protection was a colossal 250mm thick. The speed of this machine was similar to the King Tiger, at 24 miles an hour. For close defense, the Jagdtiger was equipped with 2 machine guns. One of these was the familiar MG-34. The other was the new MG-42, which quickly became a much feared weapon amongst the Allies due to its high rate of fire.
This is the Jagdtiger. It was the hunting version of the King Tiger, and this was the largest armoured vehicle to see service in World War II. Up above us here we have the 128mm anti-tank gun, which was big enough to destroy any tank at almost any range that it could see or hit the target. It was hugely armoured with this great metal box on top of the King Tiger chassis. Only 70 or 80 of these machines saw action in their own heavy tank battalion in the Ardennes campaign.
The Jagdtiger was a highly effective tank destroyer, but only a total of 70 Tiger II chassis were ever converted to the new design. This was enough to equip 2 heavy tank destroyer units. One of these, the 653rd, saw action during the Ardennes offensive. This very imposing machine was more suited to the open country and not the close confines of the Ardennes. The overstressed engine and transmission did provide the crews with a few problems.
It was almost impossible to maintain. It had been designed and built in such short time scales that there wasn't really time to test them properly. If they had been tested properly, I think it would have been quickly proved that these things were well beyond the limit of the engine to drive it, and the suspension to bear it, and the tracks to carry it around. It suffered from all of the problems of the Tiger II in terms of being able to negotiate villages. In addition, it was so large you couldn't really conceal it on the battlefield, so it was designed to stand there as a kind of a semi-mobile pillbox. It would take up a position, it would engage the Allied tanks at the longest possible range, because with this gun we really had no answer to a machine like the Jagdtiger, and its only hope was to keep the Allied tanks at a sufficient distance that it could destroy them at a range before they could get close enough to fire their own guns.
Overall, this vehicle was an excellent destroyer of Allied tanks. But its introduction was too late in the war and the numbers too few to have any effect on the final outcome. The manufacture of assault guns was more cost-effective, and these types increasingly proved their worth on the battlefield. More and more resources were put into developing new designs, and the trend was not always to larger machines.
One vehicle which was produced in rather large numbers was a vehicle called the Hetzer. Now the Hetzer was a very, very small vehicle, but with a very large gun, and was actually probably one of the finest vehicles the Germans had used.
The Hetzer, in contrast to the 70 tons of the Jagdtiger, only weighed 16 tons and carried a 4-man crew in its interior. Despite its small size, it packed a punch as it was armed with a powerful 75mm L48 gun. It had a single 7.92mm machine gun for close quarter fighting. The armour protection was 60mm thick, but being of the sloped design actually increased the protective capabilities. The top speed was 26 miles an hour.
By the middle to late 1944, the Germans had developed their tank destroyer fleet into a vehicle very similar to the one behind. This is a Hetzer light tank destroyer. Based on the 38T tank chassis, it had become obsolete. Rather than discard it, they used it, adapted it, and this is what you got. It uses a 75mm gun, which you could not put in the old 38T because it was not capable of taking that size gun. So you build a tank destroyer. They learnt the lessons from the T-34. As you can see, sloping armour. That increases the armour protection. The vehicle has a very low silhouette, but the same drawback as you got with Su-100s and the other tank destroyers. The gun has got the very limited traverse, so you have to move the vehicle. That is all right when you're attacking, because you're moving forward and you can be seen. But if you're in a defensive position, the movement would actually show your position.
Another assault gun design that was used by the Germans during the Ardennes offensive was the Jagdpanzer IV Lang. This vehicle was based on the Panzer IV chassis and weighed around 26 tons. The crew contained 4 men. Its main armament was the very potent 75mm L-70 main gun. This was the same gun that was used on the Panther. One MG-42 machine gun provided the close-quarter support. Armor protection was 80mm thick. Top speed was 24 miles an hour. This vehicle silhouette, and together with the very effective main gun, made this machine a very capable killer. These new tank designs joined the existing German machines, including the Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger. On the whole, the German tanks were probably superior to the Allies, who still relied on the Sherman.
Well, here is the only other tank in the world which equaled the production figures of the T-34, and that's the American Sherman. Again, about 45,000 were built at different marks, just like the Russian, and it was all around a very good tank, but its success is mainly because of the quantity it was produced in. The American enemies just couldn't match that sort of thing. These early Shermans, they're fitted with a 75mm gun, but not very long, as you can see, which means it hasn't got a high starting velocity of the shell. But it was changed later, and especially the latest Shermans in the end had the famous British 17-pounder, which was as good as the German 88. In places probably even better, with a tungsten shell in it. On top, of course, you got a heavy machine gun as well. And otherwise, as are most tanks, the bow machine gun, here next to the driver, the coaxial one next to the gun, you see sticking out there, and then a very heavy one on the top. And later, as well, you had anti-aircraft machine guns for defense against low-flying aeroplanes.
The Ardennes offensive was given the codename Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. Hitler had envisaged a repeat of his great victory in the summer of 1940, which knocked France out of the war. But the situation in December 1944 was very different to May 1940. For one, the planned route for the new offensive cut straight across the Ardennes. In 1940, the route used had travelled in a southwesterly direction and utilised the road system that generally ran in that direction also.
The strike of the roads, the run of the roads, follows, of course, the valley bottoms, and the valley bottoms run southwesterly. However, the Germans wanted to strike, to get to Antwerp, northwesterly. So they were striking across the grain of the countryside, across the grain of the road system. That would mean difficulties when they were trying to plan a fast, mobile offensive using tanks.
The Ardennes is a very thickly forested area. The roads, certainly in 1944 and even today, are very narrow roads, very steep roads. There's lots of areas in which they can be ambushed. For example, on a very narrow road, one anti-tank gun knocks out the first tank, nothing can get past it. And this is one of the problems that the Germans faced.
Another restrictive feature of the planning was the lack of sufficient fuel.
By late 1944, the Germans were desperately short of fuel. All of their fuel came from the Romanian oil fields, which by that time were either in the hands of the Russians or were being overrun by the Russians. The only fuel that they could produce was synthetic fuel, which was produced from coal. And so part of the overall planning for the Ardennes offensive was that the German forces, the Panzer forces in the advance, would capture and use American fuel stocks. As we know, the Americans actually destroyed those fuel stocks.
The fuel factor on its own was to play a significant part in the eventual failure of the operation. The deployment of the forces was not best suited to ensure success either. The advance towards Antwerp required the forces to swing northeast after the Germans had reached the Meuse River. Given that the Allies had strong forces in Belgium and Holland, it was suspected that they would eventually mount a counterattack into the German left flank. However, the strongest armoured German forces were situated on the right flank and too far removed to meet any potential threat. The Germans did have some elements in their favour.
In the Ardennes, the Americans had weak forces that were there for rest and recuperation, or there were units that had been badly mauled in the fighting and they were there to, it was a quiet part of the line, and that was another reason why the Germans attacked.
The other point is, of course, it's unpleasant fighting conditions. This is December 1944. It's cold, rain, sleet, very difficult conditions for fighting in. The Germans, of course, were rather more accustomed to this, given their experience on the Eastern Front, and so Hitler may well have thought that that was a gain for them. He was also, of course, hoping that the weather would keep the Allied air forces at bay.
The much-feared Yarbos, or rocket-firing planes, struck fear into the heart of every German soldier. The poor weather situation prevalent in the middle of December 1944 would keep the Allied planes on the ground for the vital opening phases of the attack. This would hopefully allow the advance to make a good start and reach some of the objectives. When the attack began, the scale of the German forces unleashed surprised the Allied commanders. Some of them had suspected a German attack around this time, but not to this extent. Some of the forces that were part of the German attack had been severely mauled during the Normandy battles. The planned area of attack was also being held by Allied troops who themselves had only recently been involved in heavy fighting around the Hürtgen forest. Hitler was confident of success and did not allow any alterations to his plans. By the 16th of December, everything was in place. The quiet Ardennes sector was about to erupt with the sound of battle. The panzers were once again moving west. The Germans had assembled an impressive lineup of tank forces for the offensive. The powerful 6th Panzer Army were positioned in the north under Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. This force included the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, 9th SS Hitler Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and the 12th SS Panzer Division. Their task was to advance along the route from their forming up area near Dahlem in Germany and into Belgium, around the town of Lochheim. Their objective was to cross the Meuse River just below Liège and advance onto Antwerp. Just to the south of this force was the 5th Panzer Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Hasso von Manteuffel. He had the 2nd Panzer, 9th Panzer, 116th Panzer, and the Panzer Lehr divisions, together with the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Their objective was to move from Prüm in Germany and onto Antwerp via Brussels. The 7th Army, under General Erich Bradenberger, was to take the southernmost route into Luxembourg. This was the infantry-only formation, made up from the 5th Infantry Divisions, including a better halved parachute division. They were to move from Bitburg in Germany and into the area held by the US 3rd Army with the objective of tying down these forces. All these forces were part of Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Model. They had very limited reserves in the shape of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the Führer Begleit Brigade and the Führer Grenadier Brigade. This total force had 2,000 artillery pieces, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and 250,000 men. To have assembled this impressive force after the destructive battles in Normandy and the East was an exceptional feat on its own.
Hitler recognized that the greatest factor that would operate to the German advantage would be surprise. No commanders were to travel with copies of the plan if they were going to go by air. There was to be no radio traffic concerning the plan. All communications were to be by hand, personally delivered, and if necessary, destroyed afterwards. Knowledge of the plan was kept on a very strict need-to-know basis. Then, as far as the movement of forces was concerned, movement was at night only in order to avoid Allied air reconnaissance. There were strict instructions about camouflage, so very strict precautions to achieve surprise.
The storm was about to break on just 4 infantry divisions, who were part of the US 5th Corps under Major General Gerau. 2 were positioned opposite the 6th Panzer Army. Facing Manteuffel in the center were the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, who were part of Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps. In the south, facing Brandenberger's men, were the 9th Armored and the 4th Infantry Divisions. All of these American units had recently been involved in heavy fighting and were in the area for a rest. They totaled around 80,000 men, less than 450 tanks and assault guns, and around 400 artillery pieces. Although initially outnumbered, the Allies had strong forces positioned close by, including Patton's 3rd Army, that could be called upon to back up the defenses in this area. On the morning of the 16th of December, the German artillery opened fire along the entire front line. The object of this was to confuse the enemy, disrupt their lines of communication, and open gaps in the lines. Due to the extreme secrecy beforehand, the Germans were unable to identify the Allied positions in advance. The result was that the German bombardment had limited success. It did sever Allied lines of communication, inflict some casualties, and provide some confusion, but not to the extent that was hoped for by the Germans. In the north, Dietrich's forces advanced towards Elsenborn Ridge. A German parachute drop had been ordered for this area, with the objective of capturing a vital road junction in the Baraque Michel. This drop did not go well, as the paras were scattered over a wide area. They found themselves in amongst the US 1st Infantry Division, so the small force had to fight its way back to their own lines. The failure of this small but significant action would help to delay the advance of the SS armor. Dietrich's men had Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper at their head. This SS officer was a seasoned veteran of Russia and Normandy. He had a battalion of 45 King Tigers under his command, but in the opening stages they were not with the lead force. He helped to ensure that the advance got off to a good start towards the Elsenborn Ridge under the cover of the bad weather. However, the Americans gave a good account of themselves and succeeded in preventing the Germans from taking this vital high ground. Slightly south of here, the main body of the 1st SS Panzer Division moved into the gap that had been opened up between the US 5th and 8th Corps. The route of their advance was towards Honsfield, which they reached on the following day. Various delays had taken place, but by the end of day 1, progress had been made. In the 5th Panzer Army's area, the advance got under a good start. They moved against the thinly spread American units and forced through the enemy positions. Some of the American forces slowed the advance and managed to hold some of the bridges in the area. By the end of day 1, however, crossings had been made over the Our River and the German panzers rolled on towards Clairvaux. Further south, the 7th Army ran into similar difficulties to Dietrich. The ground was favorable to the defender, and Brandenberger's men made little headway.
Deal of confusion reigned for the first day or so, but after that the plan began to fall apart, partly because once the initial surprise was overcome, American soldiers stood and fought, and this slowed the German advance down, especially in key areas. The roads proved as difficult to negotiate as had been anticipated, slowed down again.
Overall, although difficulties had been encountered, the 17th of December would see the all-important armour committed in strength. However, the American High Command was starting to react to the German attack. Reinforcements were being rushed to the area to meet the threat. Among these reinforcements were the 7th and 10th Armoured Divisions, together with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. These last two units were ordered to the vital road junction of Bastogne. The German attempt to reach their objective continued. Dietrich in the north was keen to make progress. He moved the 12th SS Panzer Division from their attack on Elsenborn Ridge and pushed them in behind the 1st SS Panzer Division, who were moving towards the Amblève River. The move actually helped to relieve the pressure on the Americans defending the ridge area. This allowed them to catch their breath and set up a defense that the Germans could not breach. Dietrich had an ace up his sleeve in the shape of the 150th Panzer Brigade. This force was under the command of Otto Skorzenay, who is probably best known for his dramatic rescue of Mussolini.
But part of the deception plan, the Germans actually equipped Sikorsky's units with English-speaking Germans wearing American uniforms and driving American vehicles. The idea was to spread confusion amongst the American forces. These units would actually go ahead and capture the fuel supplies, and then the panzer units would refuel and continue their advance towards the Channel ports and towards Antwerp.
They were also to pass false information to the enemy and generally cause confusion. They did have some successes. The most notable was when they reached the Meuse. They were unable to capitalize on this success as the main body of troops were too far behind. Also, groups of them began to get stopped and arrested by the Americans. The rumors quickly spread that there were Germans driving around posing as friendly forces. Everyone became a suspect, and some very high-ranking American officers found themselves in awkward situations. Eisenhower himself was confined to his headquarters for fear of assassination. Although their objectives were not entirely reached, the psychological effect that this unit had was very widespread and out of proportion to the small numbers involved. Most of those that were captured were shot as spies. Piper's advance in the north had come across a group of Americans whom they took prisoner. They were held in a field near the crossroads at Malmedy. It was here that around 80 of them were shot. The Americans claimed that this was in cold blood. The Germans claimed that they were trying to escape. The bodies were found a short time later, and the search went out for the culprits. The story spread throughout the American lines and actually helped to instill resistance in the men. Just before this incident, Piper's men had succeeded in capturing a fuel dump at Bulge. This had helped the advance to continue. They reached the bridge at Stavelot, but were held up for a number of hours when they came under attack. The advance into Stavelot did resume the following morning, and the town was captured. The advance continued towards Trois Ponts, close to here were the bridges that cross the Salme and Amblève rivers. These bridges were destroyed by the American defenders as Piper's men approached.
Germans got stopped. They American anti-tank guns. People like Team Cherry was just one anti-tank gun on a corner, and a very narrow corner, a very narrow bend with a railway bridge over the top. The Tiger tank came through under the bridge, got knocked out. That was that route blocked. They went another way, and the Americans blew up the bridges so they couldn't cross the river. The Amblève, for example, that stopped the offence. There was only 5 or 6 roads they could use. Well, as each road got blocked, the offence just petered out.
Piper was forced to move back towards La Glaise. He tried to advance through to Chenot, where another bridge crossed the Amblève, but came under attack from American planes. He decided to set up defenses around La Glaise and Stoumont. With the failure of this advance, the main emphasis was shifted to the 5th Panzer Army's sector. They were having better luck against the US 106th Division. However, the US 101st Airborne Division had reached Bastogne and set up all-around defenses. They offered such stiff resistance that Manteuffel ordered his forces to bypass the town and continue their advance. This created a bulge within a bulge and would provide a very prickly thorn in the German side.
The Germans couldn't take Bastogne principally because of the Allied generals' reactions. When the offensive began, within a matter of a day or so, Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, saw how the situation was developing, and he saw that places like Bastogne and a similar town called St. Vith were going to be crucial because they were road junctions. They commanded some key roads going through the fighting area, and so he sent at great speed a very experienced American division, the 101st Airborne Division, to occupy Bastogne.
On the 22nd of December, the Germans went to Bastogne with a white flag and the offer of surrender for the Americans. The garrison commander, General McAuliffe, offered his famous nuts reply. The vital town of Saint-Vith, further north, had fallen to the Germans on the same day. They had been battling around this town for days, and like in other areas, these delays allowed the Americans to build up defenses further back. On the 24th, Manteuffel's forces reached an area just west of Celle. This was to become the furthest point reached by the Germans during this offensive. Christmas Day, 1944, saw the besieged Bastogne coming under increasing pressure from the Germans. They pushed more and more forces into this area in an attempt to eliminate the pocket. Further south, elements of Patton's forces were moving closer, and on Boxing Day they managed to force an opening through the German lines and into Bastogne. This was the beginning of Hitler's Ardennes offensive.
I think that probably the fundamental reason for failure was that Allied troops, American and British troops, after the first confusion and flight, stood their ground and fought. And it was essentially that blunted the Germans. Lots of small firefights where they imposed an hour's delay, 2 hours delay, 3 hours delay upon the attacking forces. This gave the Allied staffs time to move the reinforcements into place, which would ultimately seal off the blockage.
Another significant occurrence around this time was the improvement in the weather. This allowed the Allies to send sorties against the German positions.
Had the Germans enjoyed the same kind of logistical support and air supremacy that the Allies did, this might well have been a war winner. But as it was probably one of the worst kind of vehicles you can imagine to be in. The skies above it were completely dominated by Allied fighter bombers, and this presented a massive target that made it a lot easier for a fighter bomber to hit, and that was a frequent cause of destruction of these guys.
At L'Église, Piper could see the hopelessness of the situation. His men were receiving a pounding by American artillery and tanks. The Americans fired over 58,000 shells into this area during the battle. This provides a good picture of the punishing fire that Piper's men would have endured. He ordered that the tanks and half-tracks that had not already been destroyed by Allied fire to be destroyed by his own men to prevent their use by the enemy. They were out of vital fuel and ammunition. He left some of his men behind to give the impression that they were still battling, and also to look after the 150 American prisoners that they had captured. He took the remaining 800 survivors with him and made for German-held lines. Piper managed to reach these lines a few days later. The escape attempt had been dangerous, and on more than one occasion his men became involved in firefights with American forces that were moving across Piper's escape route. Piper not only left behind some of his men, he also left behind an impressive bag of irreplaceable armored vehicles that included 6 King Tigers, 13 Panthers, 6 Panzer IVs, and over 50 other vehicles, including around 45 armored half-tracks. These losses were hard to take at this stage of the war. Further south, the corridor into Bastogne was slowly widened. Ferocious battles took place around this area, and both sides fought desperately for control. The Americans pushed more and more forces into the Bastogne area. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans called the battle, was proving a very hard fight for both sides. As the Allies were able to push more forces into the area, they slowly succeeded in pushing the Germans back. By the 2nd of January 1945, the front line had been reduced by around 15 kilometers. Although the Ardennes offensive is always associated with American forces, the British forces also played a vital role. In the early stages of the offensive, Montgomery had recognized the importance of the River Meuse to the Germans and had placed strong British forces in a defensive position along the northern sector. He was also given command of some of the American forces. This in itself caused a rift between the Allies and in some respects almost helped Hitler to achieve his goal. When the time was right, Montgomery launched a counterattack into the German lines with the objective of linking with the Americans further south. This objective was finally reached on the 4th of January at the town of La Roche. What this meant was that a solid defensive line now existed that the Germans could not hope to penetrate. Also, the River Meuse, that was vital to German success, was now out of reach. Hitler still ordered the advance to continue and achieve the original objective, but at this stage this was an increasingly impossible task. The intensity of the battle is best described by Patton himself, who on the 6th of January expressed his very real fears that the war could still be lost by the Allies. The 1st SS Panzer Division were moved down to this area to help destroy the Americans at the end of December. This did nothing to change the final outcome and only added to the German casualty list. The Allied fighters flew sortie after sortie against the Germans and inflicted further aerial destruction on the increasingly pressurized German forces. The Luftwaffe launched their own attacks around the start of January, when around 1,000 planes flew against Allied targets. This attack had some notable successes, including the destruction of 300 Allied aircraft and the damage to around 25 Allied airfields. Around the middle of January, some of the German units were withdrawn, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. This put even more pressure on the remaining German forces. Hitler had also launched another, smaller offensive called Nordwind in January. It had the objective of destroying the Allied positions around the Vosges Mountains. The attacks quickly bogged down against the Allied defenders, but fighting did continue until the middle of January. The operation itself achieved nothing of any significance, but it represented a high, irreplaceable cost to the Germans in men and machines.
The aftermath of the offensive was that the battlefield was covered with abandoned German tanks, left by the crews because they'd run out of fuel, either destroyed by the crews themselves or destroyed by Allied tanks or by Allied air power.
By the end of January, the front line was back to where it had been at the start of the German offensive 6 weeks earlier. The loss of the Ardennes offensive removed any reserves that the Germans possessed and that could have been used in the defense of the Reich. In the east, the Russians had launched their new offensive in January 1945. There was nothing available to counter this threat. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed completely. The end of the Third Reich was in sight.
On the morning of 13th of June 1944, during the fierce battles in Normandy, SS Obersturmführer Wittmann and the crew of his heavy Tiger tank were standing ready for action. They were about to take part in one of the most famous tank actions in military history. Wittmann had left his company to reconnoiter the battlefield when he became aware of the presence of an entire British armored battalion halted on the road nearby. Undaunted, Wittmann drove his single Tiger at the column, firing on the move. The Tiger gained the element of surprise and quickly destroyed 12 half-tracks, 3 light tanks, and 6 medium tanks.
One of the most striking examples, of course, not so much of tank warfare, but of the handling of an individual tank. Indeed, what it could do and its capability was demonstrated in 1944 by Hauptmann Wittmann in his Tiger tank. Here you've got an accomplished tank commander, which he clearly was, with perhaps an expert eye for the tactical situation. And I think it's probably a record in maybe in tank warfare history that he was able with one tank to disable what was virtually a British tank column.
Wittmann calmly departed the scene of carnage to report, rearm, and gather reinforcements. 2 hours later, he returned to battle. This time he destroyed a further 12 medium tanks, 4 heavy tanks, and 14 Bren gun carriers. All in a day's work for the most successful tank commander in history.
Michael Wittmann was really probably the most successful junior tank commander of the entire Second World War. Not only did he achieve a unprecedentedly high kill rate, 138 tanks, 132 anti-tank guns. But he was also the recipient of some of Nazi Germany's highest awards, for example, the Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves and Swords, which was effectively the German equivalent of the Victoria Cross. So in sheer statistical terms, he was an extremely successful commander. He was also an extremely competent leader, an inspirational leader, one might say. And this, I think, leads on to something else which is also important, which is Michael Wittmann's propaganda value to the Nazi propaganda machine. It wasn't simply a question of what he did on the battlefield. It was his influence and his inspiration to other German fighting men and to the factory workers who produced the Tiger tanks with which Wittmann achieved most of his victories that was also particularly important. So regardless of what one thinks of his political viewpoint, and of course he was a dedicated National Socialist, in sheer military terms at the tactical level, and in terms of his psychological impact, both upon Germans and indeed upon the Allies, his impact was immense.
Michael Wittmann was born in the tiny village of Vogeltal in the Upper Pfalz on the 22nd of April 1914. He was the first son of a farmer, Johann Wittmann, and his wife Ursula. In 1934, at the age of 21, Wittmann joined the German army, signing up for a 2-year tour. In the first days of the Nazi regime, compulsory military service had not yet been reintroduced, so Wittmann was a volunteer when he reported for military service in Freising with the 19th Infantry Regiment. As a small standing army, comprised exclusively of volunteers, the interwar Reichswehr was a high-quality force which expected very high standards. Wittmann met those exacting standards, and after 1 year in the service, he was promoted to Gefreiter on the 1st of November, 1935. 1936 was the halcyon period for the Nazi Party in Germany. The first flushes of economic successes for Hitler's National Socialists impressed the young Wittmann. In the closed world of the military, the fervent Nazi beliefs of many of his colleagues also made an impression. Many of his colleagues planned to join the newly formed Waffen-SS, and Wittmann decided that he too would join the military wing of the Nazi Party after his own army service. On the 1st of November 1936, Wittmann applied for admission to the SS and was accepted into what was to become one of the most notorious organizations in history.
The Waffen-SS, or armed SS, was essentially the regular armed forces or ideological spearhead of the National Socialist cause, composed, at least in its early stages, of racially pure, ideologically utterly committed and extremely physically fit young men. It eventually grew to a strength by 1945 of almost 1 million personnel and provided something like 40 combat divisions for the German armed forces.
The Waffen-SS actually stands for armed SS, so that they are specifically fighting soldiers, and they were unusual in that they were very innovative in their tactics and also things like their dress. They were some of the first troops to use camouflage clothing.
In the case of many exceptional German soldiers, such as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, revisionists have subsequently tried to play down the enthusiasm they held for Hitler and all he stood for. This is not true of Michael Wittmann. In his case, there was to be no redeeming conversion or late change of allegiance. He was a simple man, and the seductive allure of the Nazi Party drew his unquestioning obedience. Sadly, he was never to swerve from that evil path. Wittmann was given the SS number 311623 and proved to be a model National Socialist. In his free time, he participated in sports, recruiting, and took part in the mass political demonstrations and rallies of the period. In contrast to the frantic world of mass political rallies, Wittmann's first SS military posting was less than glamorous. He was employed as a guard at the large Wehrmacht munitions dump. Wittmann was soon bored with his routine. He wanted to be near the center of this new force in Germany, so he applied to join the SS Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard. Already, this was the best known and most elite unit in the Third Reich.
The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler might reasonably be described as Hitler's Praetorian Guard. Formed in 1933 as a bodyguard for the Führer personally, it later expanded as the military vanguard of National Socialism, if you like, and in 1943 eventually became a fully fledged panzer division of the Waffen-SS with a strength of about 20,000 men. Both as a division and earlier as a regiment, it participated on the most important fronts of the Second World War, acting as an armoured spearhead for German offensive actions, and as a fire brigade that was sent to collapsing sectors of the front in order to prop them up. So an absolutely elite formation.
Thanks to his rigorous military background, Wittmann met the very strict selection criteria and was accepted. He began training with his new unit on the 5th of April, 1937, at the main cadet school in Berlin-Leichefeld. Wittmann was assigned to the 17th Company, which was an armored scout car platoon. As part of an elite formation, the men of the armored scout company received an intensive training course, which transformed them into experts. These skills were later to stand him in good stead, but for the time being, the newfound expertise was not needed. Hitler was still achieving his aims by a mixture of bluff and inspired gambles. In October 1938, Wittmann took part in the entry into the Sudetenland. The reception he witnessed as waves of excitement swept through the people made a lasting impression on him. The storm of jubilation eclipsed even the fervent National Socialist rallies which he had attended. He was awarded his first of many medals, commemorating the reunification of Austria and the Sudetenland with the German Reich. From now on, medals and decorations would occupy a special place in Wittmann's affections.